sepan. What's up, mi gente? It's your host of Aquí Estamos, Marco Rojas, and I want to thank everyone who is taking their time to listen to today's podcast so that we can talk about different issues. But today, check this out. Today, I want to discuss Veterans Day. You know, today is Veterans Day, so I want to wish everybody happy Veterans Day. Shout out to all the veterans that sacrificed for this nation. But I really want to show in this episode how Latinos should be remembered for their impact and their sacrifice for this nation. And we all know about how many different ethnic groups had an impact in enlisting in the military, playing a part in wars that we hear in the textbooks, right? Asian Americans, African Americans, and etc. And still were denied equal opportunities at home once they arrived, facing racism, prejudice, abuses, and even lynchings. And so it was no different for Latino America or Latino Americans. And so what we want to do is use today as one of those days to really remember the sacrifice and the hard work for nuestra gente that has put in for our military today and even yesterday. So check this out, mi gente. This is, for the longest, I've been wanting to talk about these issues, things that we know we don't talk about in our textbooks, things that we don't talk about when we're in class, K through 12, you know, where the textbook commemorates George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, etc. And it's like, okay, what about nuestra gente? Because I feel like we were involved, right? So this episode is to commemorate not only the history of Latinos that had an impact on this nation, but also today those that serve, and also individuals that have served and lost their rights, you know. So first off, I just want to talk about one war that, you know, well, I'm going to talk about 3 wars that Latinos have had an impact, right? So the first one we talk about is the Revolutionary War, right? Where we think about the Bunker Hill, the Battle of Yorktown, stuff like that. And you know, all we think about is those individuals that have had an impact, white individuals that led this nation to freedom, or quote unquote freedom, right? And so we never talk about those that have sacrificed in the war. And that's, you know, quiero hablar de los Latinos, man, that really had an impact. You know, I like to call this the Latino experience in the Revolutionary War, because one Latino figure that we don't talk about is General Bernardo de Galvez. And, you know, just about him, he was just one of those that helped assist George Washington fight off the British, right, coming from the Southwest. You know, he was a huge impact to this war. He provided weapons when Spain wasn't even involved, and he organized Native Americans. He freed African Americans to fight off the British. So, you know, why isn't he in the textbooks when he helped George Washington win key battles, right? Even we have another individual that was born in Caracas, Venezuela, Francisco de Miranda, that fought for the Spanish and literally helped Washington win the battle in Yorktown. And once again, I go back to these individuals that aren't ever spoken about in the textbooks. Do I think it's on purpose? Probably, you know. But at the end of the day, this is my job to hopefully have you guys even do your own research and see, you know, man, there might be some folks that I don't even know about. And there's so many individuals, guys, that when I'm saying that have had an impact in the war or any wars, this is what I mean, you know, but it's never discussed. And then for our Cubans out there, man, Cubanos, like, what people don't know is, like, they were a huge financial contributor, you know, in equipping thousands of General Washington troops, you know. So Cuba's first Creole Captain General, Governor of La Habana, Juan Manuel de Cajigal y Montserrat, like, he helped huge fundraising campaigns with Cuban elites. So these Cuban elites actually assisted so much to the revolutionary effort. And yet again, another story that we don't really hear about. And at the time, they gave about 1.2 million pounds of sterling to Washington, which today, if you would make the equation, today it would be worth like $28 million. So the fact that 20, how much of money that Washington received is such an impact to not only the revolutionary effort, but just the experience of the Latinos that were willing to help out the colonists to fight for this quote unquote freedom that, in truthful and in all reality, wasn't for everyone. And that actually takes us to, another war that like our textbooks like brings so much hype about, which was a civil war where we always hear about Lincoln freeing the slaves and what was the effort of the Confederacy, right, trying to promote white supremacy. And you know the Civil War actually took place right after one of the worst wars in Mexican American history for the Chicanos, or just Mexico in general, where just a little background story of Mexico was stolen by the U.S. in 1848 after the Mexican American War. So, you think about Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, California, or Utah, like all these areas in the Southwest, all the way to the West Coast. This all belonged to Mexico at one point. And in my opinion, I think one of the most racist presidents towards Mexicanos outside of Trump, way more, was James K. Polk. And what he literally did was, he instigated a war so that he had the sole intention to take away Mexico and all its land, because he didn't view them as equals. He had written a lot of letters and written so many things that in reality showed his hatred towards Latinos, but most definitely he just was not feeling the Mexican vibe there. That he felt this was manifest destiny. That white people deserve this land. This is their land. This was God had granted them this land. So he literally he really instigated this war. And what he did was, at the time he took advantage of a weak Mexican government. They faced their own corruption, and he went in there with the military. He went beyond their borderlands, and obviously started. Mexico had to start shooting, and once again that started the war. But he knew what he was doing. He instigated it. And so at that time, Texas and all these other states, Southern, they wanted to maintain this form of slavery. So after the war had ended, the United States won and actually received this land from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Ultimately, it literally led to individuals living in the South that, even Latinos at this time, supported Confederacy and supported the ideology of white supremacy. But it was split. It wasn't just Mexicanos just believing in the Confederacy effort. No, it was, they also lived in the North and also provided military to fight off the Confederate soldiers. So we also had Latinos, Mexicanos living in the North, and they basically, it was North and South, right? So they were split between Union and Confederacy. And when this war happened, we already know from the textbooks, the South believed in states' rights, but in reality they just wanted slaves. They seen them as commodity. You've watched The 13th. If you haven't, I recommend it. It's on Netflix. Really good series. They really wanted to keep their economic booms with the slaves, right? Like they believed African Americans were just commodities. They were just a piece of of resource for them. And the Union really wanted to split, really wanted to break that system and actually bring them together into a nation once again. But I just want to talk about the variety of reasons also that Latinos were involved. So there were still Latinos, Spanish descent, still had a lot of European blood in them. Some were aristocrats, man. They had a lot of money, they had power. So at the time, they wanted to preserve the way of life, and so they fought for a variety of reasons. And once again, they were split, but a lot of them fought for the Confederate way of life. And then we also had Latinos that were in poverty, and they just fought so they can fight for a better future for themselves. And actually represents today, right? Where, Latinos or just individuals that come from nothing, literally have done whatever they can so that they can move up the social economic class. And so in total, 20,000 Latino soldiers participated in the Civil War. Both of them sacrificed their lives. When I say both of them, I mean both from the Confederates and both from the Unions, sacrificed their lives. And, we've seen so much bravery, especially on the Union side, where we've seen young individuals like 16 years old, a man or a young boy named Luis F. Emilio. He was 16 years old, the son of a Spanish immigrant. And he literally lied about his age in order to enlist in the army or in the military. And, his bravery, he was fighting, he was sacrificing whatever he could. And he literally was promoted into lead as an officer in one of the African American units. And so we don't really talk about, these individuals. And, as a young man, sacrificing, volunteering to fight for something he believed in, and really showed the bravery that Latinos were willing to take to fight up for any cause. And so, these are just some instances that really should be commemorated in our textbooks, and regardless of what Latino, they were literally fighting for the Confederacy, fighting for the Union. We often have to, evaluate what was their motives and what was their desires and who did they want to support. And a lot of it really came down to social economic classes. Those individuals that came from, nothing, they literally were fighting for the Union. They really wanted to move up in the social economic ladder. They felt like they believed in something within this country. And those that really were wealthy aristocrats, they actually fought for the Confederacy to keep that preservation of wealth by exploiting human beings. But this is the reality of wars, right? So that's something to really look at. So another war that tends to be talked about in the textbooks, growing up, this was one of my favorite wars to learn about. But once again, I didn't have any idea, right, of World War II and the impact of Chicanos and other Latino groups that participated in the war. Here's the thing with different ethnic groups, mostly or all the ethnic groups that were oppressed during this time participated in World War II. You have African Americans that had their own units but segregated, Asian Americans that were segregated, especially Japanese Americans during this time, because they felt like the white Americans felt like they were spies or they were the true enemies. But in reality, they were really fighting for the United States and for what had happened in Pearl Harbor. But yet, many Americans didn't feel that way. And that was just due to their own prejudices, their own racism, things that they just, till today, we still face, right? But, African Americans being lynched right after the war, this was still going on. Japanese Americans still treated as second class citizens, as well as other Asian Americans. But Chicanos as well. And Chicanos and other Latino groups participated in this war. And in the reality, Chicanos had a sense of patriotism at this time. And what I mean by that is, their parents or their grandparents had immigrated here to the United States. So they really knew very little about Mexican culture, or maybe they did, but they were really tied to the United States. They were, in a way, they felt like they were American or Americans, right? And that really came down to when World War II broke out. They were like, I'm going to represent the United States. But with that sense of patriotism, it's very little were they recognized as Americans. And they were also viewed as second class citizens and were segregated into their own troops. So there you could see an instance of lack of equality, lack of equity as well. But with all that, guys, I'm telling you that Chicanos, like, we're talking about 500,000 Chicanos served. 500,000 Chicanos served in this time. And when I'm saying they're willing to sacrifice and fight for this nation, they did. But that doesn't mean that racism and prejudices didn't exist as well. Not only were they segregated, um, I'm more than certain that there was just this high racial tension in the military, and one of those high tensions really broke out in the streets. And I'm pretty sure you guys know about the Zoot Suit riots, right? Where the white Marine bigots were out there looking for young Chicanos, whoever were dressing in Zoot Suits. So this was the style back in the day where it was like you see Zoots, but they were more baggy. So whenever they seen young Chicanos, they probably didn't even know them, but just because of the way they dressed, they literally will go in and jumped them and started attacking them. But this was the racism towards Chicanos. So if these military men had this towards young Chicanos, imagine how they felt with other Chicanos inside the military. And we fail to really understand that a lot of the sacrifice came with pain, and what I mean by that is they were willing to sacrifice for a nation that didn't give them the love back. But 11 Chicanos also received the Medal of Honor because of their bravery and because of their sacrifice for this nation. And so there's a case that I wanted to talk about, a World War II veteran, a young Chicano. His name was Felix Longoria from Texas. And it really brought about social civil rights issues when, he was killed in action, and his remains were shipped to the U.S. So after all the sacrifice that he was able to do, the funeral home where he was going to be buried refused to have his remains there because they felt that only white Americans were allowed to be buried there. So you have a young Chicano, that sacrificed his life literally, and the widow trying to bury her husband that had passed away or was killed in action, was really trying to just only bury her husband. But the owner of the funeral home literally said, we just never made it a practice to let them, and referring to them as Mexican Americans, to use this chapel to start now. And so what we see is that it was true because all across the Southwest there was segregation against Chicanos, Mexican Americans, and it really demonstrated in this fact. And this is where you see the young push for the civil rights movement, not only for blacks and Asians, but the LGBTQ community, but we also see it from Chicanos, where they were not going to take it anymore, where their sacrifice went into vain, and yet they can't even be buried properly just because of segregation and white supremacy. So this was one of those things where we seen the sacrifices of young men, yet they weren't received with open arms coming back home, whether you were dead or alive. So as we're talking about how Latinos have sacrificed everything, sacrificed their own lives, time with their family to fight for what we call freedom in the textbooks, yet weren't received, the same from other Americans. We're going to really look at now how it impacts. I'm not going to spend too much time because I really want us to talk about the issue that we see today. And that's with individuals that have already served, who weren't citizens, and have given, their sacrifice, and in a way has been in vain, because thousands of veterans that weren't documented have now been deported. And we see this time and time again. Once again, it comes down to administration. From 2013 to 2018, 92 veterans were deported, and these numbers are just increasing. And there is an organization, groups of deported veterans that really have fought, and their mission is to advocate and assist U.S. military veterans who are facing deportation. And when I first heard about this, I was in shock because, we have so many Americans today complaining about this immigration issue, and yet we see deported veterans, fighting for their rights, and yet they're being deported. And it's like, this is the reality of not only this administration, but administrations in the past that have seen Latinos and other individuals that have came into this country, whether they were unlawful, and that's the terms that conservatives would like to use. Yet I guess we dismiss the sacrifices that these men and women have fought for our country, yet the benefits were reaped because of their sacrifice. So today we really want to look into not only those that have served for our nation, that have fought for our nation, but also look at the ultimate impact that it has had on their lives. Those individuals that are facing PTSD, many traumatic disorders that has affected their lives, and yet now they're being treated as second-class citizens. And not even, some individuals not even treated as citizens. They've given their sacrifice, their love, their patriotism, their loyalty to this nation, and look how they've been repaid. They've been deported, they lost their rights, and they lost everything. Yo, what's up, mi gente? I just want to thank everyone who took the time to listen to today's episode of Aquí Estamos con Marco Rojas. I know that today is Veterans Day, and I just really want to commemorate all the veterans that sacrificed their lives for this nation. I also want to give a shout out to the Latinos that helped build this nation as well. If you haven't had a chance